Next up we have Dr. Maron Sullivan, and this one I can do off the top of my head because I've known Maron for a very long time. Maron Sullivan is not only my co-curator of the Harry Bertoia exhibition, she is a really wonderful independent curator and scholar, and happens to be the director of the Harry Bertoia Catalog Raisonné project. And so she has been trying to wrap her arms around this incredibly prolific artist production for the past several years, and I'm sure has several more years ahead of her trying to wrap her arms around it. So if you know of anyone who has Bertoias, call Maron. She wants to know about them. Maron, one of the reasons why I know Maron so well is that we last worked together on an exhibition that was here in 2013 called Return to Earth, that looked at ceramic sculpture circa World War II, and she wrote a brilliant essay on the two Italians that were featured in that exhibition, Fausto Melotti and, I'm totally blanking on, Lucio Fontana. Thank you, Maron. And even prior to that, Maron, is it okay if I out you? Yes. Maron is Nasher, is it Nasher through and through. She worked with me here at the Sculpture Center from 2004 to about 2010. In a variety of positions. The last one was as a curatorial intern, and while she was getting her master's degree here at SMU. She then went on to get her PhD at the University of Michigan, studying with the great sculpture scholar Alex Potts, who was for a time one of the jury members for the Nasher Prize, and is largely considered to be the most important sculpture scholar living and working today. So she had some good training up there, and she's held fellowships at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, and written several books. So I'm lucky to get to work with her, and you are fortunate to have her here to talk to you about Harry Bertoia's architectural commissions and his relationship with architects. Maron?
Hello. As Jed intoned there, it's really special for me to be back at the Nasher. Speaking of anniversaries, I think, yeah, 18 years next month is when I started at Visitors Experience upstairs. So it is like coming home and really special. I think it's rare when you get to work with your mentor and have your mentor become such an amazing friend. So it's been a really, really special project to work on this, and definitely years in the making. So yeah, as Jed mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit today about the large-scale commissions, which has become a bit of an obsession of mine, and I'll try to keep it to the 20 minutes today. And also, as Jed mentioned about the catalog raisonné, I'm not joking when I say please do contact me. Tell anybody you know who owns or has known about a Bertoia to contact me. I'll probably be working on that project until I'm dead. So you have time, but we are hoping to publish. It'll be an online publication and an ongoing living publication, because it will never be done, and we hope to publish the first stage next year. So, on the subject of obsession, as I've been thinking about Bertoia for a number of years now, a funny thing has started to happen where I see Bertoia everywhere. And I think this is something when you kind of come into the club of Bertoia enthusiasts, obsessives, you will also start to notice Bertoia being everywhere. And sometimes it occurs at places like the Farnsworth House outside of Chicago, where I live, where the combination of Bertoia with Mies makes a lot of sense. And you will see it on city streets, as in Paley Park in New York. But you'll also start to become really acutely aware when you're just watching television or movies. You start to kind of notice these details, and yes, even when you watch 90210, there's a Bertoia chair in it. So this has certainly occurred with the chairs, and then people start to know that you are a Bertoia obsessive, and so your friends and colleagues start to send you all sorts of weird things, including this brilliant Craigslist ad of somebody putting their own spin on the Bertoia chairs, which you will also notice ups the price somehow. And you'll notice it on Antiques Roadshow and other kind of things about the market. And then even this morning, I had a friend who sent me this message from T Magazine's Instagram feed today, and my friend was like, look, your show is just part of the zeitgeist. There's Bertoia even influencing design and fashion. Bertoia is everywhere. And a little bit more concretely, though, beyond the chairs, Bertoia actually is everywhere. You may not notice, but if you live in a major metropolitan area, around the country, around the world, you may happen upon a Bertoia sculpture when you are shopping for a parka at North Face. They've removed the screen now. It's much, you can see the whole screen, the whole thing. Or when you're shopping outside of Minneapolis at Victor Gruen's Southdale Mall. You may also notice it when you are on the MIT campus and go into their beautiful Saarinen-designed chapel, or when you are in the public library in Dallas. Even if you go outside of the United States, this screen still stands in Venezuela on what was the US Embassy building and is now their official Bureau of Tourism, and it was done with an architect named Don Hatch. I am fortunate to say that most of the large-scale commissions are still in situ where they were originally commissioned for, and I think that's actually a testament to Bertoia's very keen awareness of the sites, the specificity of the sites he was working with. They become part of the fabric of those structures. Occasionally, though, things change. People don't really realize what occurs. So this really beautiful, it's kind of hard to see in this photo, but at the center of the bar in the Denver Hilton Hotel, which the hotel still stands, it was an IMP Associates project, and there was a beautiful dandelion right in the middle of this circular bar. The bar was made circular, and the dandelion, the massive dandelion was set on a marble base inside of it. And there was actually another set of screens in the lobby just past this photo. This piece is now today in the collection of Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. So there is some shuffling of these pieces. And this idea of the large-scale commissions, as I mentioned, has become an obsession. And I have a book coming out in March, I think appropriately titled Alloys, and you can see the beautiful Bertoia screen in detail on it. And I think really working on Bertoia and noticing Bertoia everywhere and noticing Bertoia in these urban environments really started my brain working in terms of how architects and urban planners and corporate clients were turning to artists. There was a really lovely, short-lived, kind of failed moment in the immediate post-war period, so the 20 years after the end of World War II, where there was a huge push to reintegrate art and architecture, right? So the kind of, if you go back through the criticism, of which there are copious amounts, there's this sense of trying to get back to kind of the medieval or Renaissance model, where art was not something seen in a gallery behind a case, but something that was really built into the fabric, right? Really existed in the space that we as human beings exist in. And when I started kind of looking at I didn't end up looking at kind of small scale projects, but like the big modernist projects of the immediate post-war period, because of course the landscape of the United States was pretty radically changing. There's a huge building boom, right, occurring, and what really became evident is that there was a very small handful of artists that architects were consistently turning to, and Bertoia was a crucial piece of that part of the equation. So alongside colleagues like Calder, Isma Noguchi, and Richard Lippold, who also is somebody who Bertoia knew, but has also kind of fallen out of a more public awareness. So these were the people, the artists that were really consistently turned to, and I think it's an interesting kind of group because all four of those artists came from engineering and design backgrounds. right? None of them were trained as kind of fine artists at the get. And I think that spirit of kind of functionality, even though maybe within art history or the art world, function and decorative can be a four-letter word, for these artists, it certainly was not. And so Bertoia, when you start to kind of look at these large-scale projects, right, and we ended up, part of what we're doing with the Catalog Raisonné project is really trying to kind of concretize a lexicon for Bertoia. I think people have kind of played fast and loose, right, and because, as Jed said, he himself was not interested in categorization, it's very confusing, I think, to kind of approach this body of work. And when we were thinking about these larger projects that he did in consultation with clients and architects, we ended up settling on this term large-scale commissions. And there was a kind of method behind that madness in that not all of them are public art in the way we think about, right? So the first inclination was to be like, oh, these are the public projects, the public art projects. Well, a lot of these were made for private clients, right? And then Bertoia being Bertoia, he did have gallery representation throughout his career, but also was not somebody overly concerned with being in part of the art world. And so he oftentimes worked with private clients directly, including the Nashers. There's really lovely correspondence between Ray and Patsy Nasher and the Bertoias. So he would also oftentimes, through Knoll and through other outlets, have collectors approach him directly and be like, well, I have this fireplace, could you do something for us? So you can't really just say private commissions either, because then are you talking about things that are more domestically scaled, or are you talking about massive screens that go on roofs of public libraries? So the idea of large-scale commission ended up kind of being a term for us that helped kind of incorporate all of these projects, of which there are over 50 that Bertoia created in his lifetime. In the catalog, we have kind of for the first time ever a complete record of those large-scale commissions. And again, they are in pretty much every city around the United States, you know, from Cincinnati to New York to Dallas and everywhere in between. And what really became fascinating for me looking at the history of the large-scale commissions is not only how many he did, but how many were essentially for repeat clients. So this example for 54, a pretty early large-scale commission, was done with Woody Garber, and he would work on numerous projects with Garber in Ohio and the Cincinnati area. And each one was different, right? Each one had different needs. And I think that is also maybe something that in the end, as kind of post-war American art history concretized itself, kind of hurt Bertoia's reputation, because he was somebody who was really able and willing to modify his own personal artistic vision for what that project demanded or needed, right? It wasn't just an imposition of his viewpoint, of his ego onto things. It really was a kind of collaborative spirit. And I love this photograph, having watched our tremendous team of art handlers this past week install this work upstairs. To see kind of Harry up on a ladder here is mind-blowing. And the work that we do have upstairs from the Seattle First National Bank in '68, the double hanging Willow, as you can see on the right-hand side, was part of a group of 36 of those double hangers. They now have kind of, the bank sold them off when they were acquired by Bank of America a number of years ago, and so they're kind of dispersed in private collections and public collections, but we are very happy to have one of them upstairs. That was not installed just on a ladder. Much more complicated. We also have an example of this project, one of his close to last projects that he created in 1977 in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, up near where I was born. And we actually, I think, have Bennett Johnson in the audience today. Yeah, so we can ask Bennett about how he worked with Bertoia. But again, for a scholar like myself, going back through the archival record, what became very apparent to me, and again, I didn't obviously know Bertoia or ever have a chance to meet him, having been born a few years after he passed away, but what became evident looking through the archival record and through the correspondence, and you know, maybe Celia can speak to some of this during the panel discussion today, was that Bertoia was a tremendously generous and kind person. somebody you wanted to work with, right? And that's not always the case with artists. And so reading through the correspondence and thinking about how he worked, and it's a complicated matrix, right? Because you have an architect that you're working for, but you usually also have a client you're working for, and that's a lot of different moving pieces to kind of contend with, and then also still want to produce something that feels like your own work. And in looking, I think, Jed's point to introduce the Cranbrook School really was foundational. And Bertoia himself talked about just how pivotal that moment, right? Kind of how I feel about the Nasher, single-handedly changing my life and getting me obsessed about sculpture. I think Cranbrook was much the same way for Bertoia. It really introduced him to a new way of thinking about his own practice and about making. And because there were no real departments, right? No majors, no kind of boundaries within how you learned and practiced. Bertoia himself was often found, in the architecture studios. So he was in charge of the metal shop. He obviously did a lot of printmaking while at Cranbrook, but he also hung out at the architecture studios with both Aero and Ilo Saarinen, Eames, everybody who was kind of going through that program as well, and actually was very involved, for example, in the Eames Saarinen furniture competition that MoMA did in the 40s. So I think that way of working collaboratively, working with colleagues, working across boundaries is something that we see directly manifested in the large-scale commissions. This is not something that he just did for a period and then left. It really, I think, became integral to his being and how he approached making. And of course, that great, I think we can just pause on that again. Just like a wonderful historical document. But I wanted to kind of include it in my talk about the large-scale commissions, because I also think it's important that when we're thinking about Bertoia and how he kind of fits into the broader historical context, he was much closer with designers and architects in terms of socialization and also in terms of collaboration. We don't really have him talking a lot about other contemporary artists at that time, which is also a little bit different than what we think of as the kind of post-war American artist, if we think about kind of schools or movements. He, I think, came out of that design and architecture background, and that's really where he kind of stood. So, the idea of him sitting, side by side with Aero here, I think also kind of speaks to his position in a slightly different microcosm, which also I think for art historians or art history has made it a little bit difficult to place him within context. And of course, the Cranbrook Circle, as it was called, would continue to be formative in terms of his projects. So the first time he ever worked at that scale, on a large scale, was for Aero Saarinen for the General Motors Technical Center, a kind of just absolute masterpiece of mid-century modern architecture. And this screen that he ends up doing, this braised screen from '53, I have a hunch, I can't really prove it, but I think the piece from MFA Houston up in the, just directly above me, I think actually might be a model for this. I think he's trying to work through some issues because that scale is, this is 120 and the piece upstairs is 122 inches. So I think, and the timing's right, but this is again the deep dive that a catalog raisonné director thinks about. He would also go on to create this work. Again, if you've seen the spill casts upstairs, this kind of mode of making will be familiar to you now. This was the last project that he worked on that was a Saarinen project, but Aero Saarinen, of course, tragically died at the end of or in the middle of the Dulles International Airport project. So Bertoia actually ended up kind of collaborating much more closely with Kevin Roche for the Dulles screens, which again, if you do ever find yourself having to go through Dulles through security, it's kind of just past the security gate. You can see it through security, and it is well worth a stop and a visit. They are just tremendous, 9 panels. And this kind of spill casting technique is something he will also return to with Kevin Roche a few years later for the Rochester Institute of Technology. They've been slightly moved on campus, but these 3 massive spill cast planters are still on the campus today, where we see them here in this atrium. I mentioned the kind of like repeat customer element of Bertoia's large-scale commissions, and perhaps no architect, actually the architect he worked mostly with, Minoru Yamasaki, and they would collaborate on 6 realized projects together over the course of the career, including one of this very early example from 1955. Bertoia, as you may notice from the gallery upstairs, his sculpture really didn't have a lot of color to it in terms of added color. But there was a period in the mid-1950s when he was experimenting with enameled metal, and one of the largest scaled projects was for the St. Louis airport, and it had kind of cool tones. You can see in the photo on the right, cool tones on one side and warm tones on the other from this kind of suspended multi-plane screen. And you can kind of get a sense of it in the black and white image by the photographer Ezra Stoller, whose images from this, if you're an architecture mid-century buff, you will definitely have seen Ezra Stoller images. And this work, tragically, I think it's destroyed. It's definitely no longer extant. When the St. Louis airport was renovated in the 60s, it was deinstalled, and no one really knows. I'm hoping it'll like turn up like in some weird like storage area at one point, but I think it's gone. But Yama and Bertoia worked really, really closely. One of the more masterful projects, I think, this 64 screen that was done for Northwestern National Life Insurance Company. This is still, it's now Voya Financial is who owns and operates the building, but still extant. Absolutely beautiful. If you're in Minneapolis, please go see it. And you can see it kind of getting packed up to be transported. Actually, it does, I put Untitled here, but this is one of the rare ones that does have it titled Sunlit Straw. So ignore my Untitled there. But you can see Bertoia and Yama talking in the upper right-hand corner. And actually, let's see if I took it out. One of the last commission, the last large-scale commission that Bertoia is alive to realize is for the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond, Virginia, that Bertoia will complete for Yama. And actually the correspondence between Yama and Bertoia is just, it's like the respect just oozes out of those letters. I think for both architect and artist, they really understood what each other was doing. And Yama had a lot of Bertoias in his house, and they had plans to do other commissions that fell through for all sorts of reasons. But I think are really, again, I think it's rare that you come together on one project and then to do multiple projects, I think really speaks to how much people liked working with Bertoia on things. And certainly that was the case with Gordon Bunshaft, who, if you're a mid-century architecture person, he was a little bit of a surly individual, not quick with the compliments, and he was very, very complimentary of Bertoia and worked, again, on multiple large-scale projects with him, including the Manufacturers Trust Bank building in New York, which is still at 510 Fifth Avenue. And you can see Bertoia kind of standing on it with his torch in the lower right-hand corner. And actually that is Bunshaft and Bertoia on the right-hand side, looking over plans. And this was something that, Bunshaft, I think a lot of times when we think about art and architecture coming together, it is not a relationship of equals, right? I don't want to seem naive about this. The artwork is not structurally foundational to these projects, and the architect is always going to have the kind of final say, and they equally have their egos as well as artists. But I think, in the case of the projects that I certainly looked at for the book, and then also in the specific case of Bertoia, Bunshaft changed the design, right? He built that building with the sculpture in mind. So this was not just something that I think that today, I think we have a very negative kind of connotation around lobby art and artwork that appears in these kind of, percent for art projects. And I think in some ways rightfully so, because art feels like an afterthought. It feels like something that's not, you pull that piece out of the building and both things will suffer from it. And when Bertoia was working on large-scale commissions, this is absolutely the case. You pull that screen out of the bank and that becomes a completely different space and a lesser than space. And I think the architect would tell you that. So it really, I think it was a different model of working. And I don't say collaboration lightly in this case, right? These artists were brought in as early as possible on the projects. The materials had resonances. The techniques were the same. So it was an attempt to really, again, meet as equals. And again, that wasn't always perfect. You know, if you read about Noguchi's experiences with Bunshaft, there was a lot of butting heads on these projects. But I think there was an attempt, again, to present a different model. I wanted to conclude, just because it's, I think, the showstopper of this exhibition, that a piece that was lent to us by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I'll explain a little bit how it got there. But this is the red wall work that we see in the lower level gallery right behind us. Again, a work that kind of, I think for Bertoia, begrudgingly has a title attached to it, a little bit of a mouthful, Sculpture Group Symbolizing World's Communication in the Atomic Age. And this is something that actually came about kind of like in its acquisition into SAM in DC, and at the bequest of the client, right? So this, as you can see in this great kind of black and white photograph, had some televisions in front of it. And again, you know, I think we have a tendency to be like, oh, that's lessening the work, it's cheapening the work, right? To have bank tellers in front of it, you know, if we think about this image of literally people like cashing checks in front of the work, or buying a parka in front of it. And I'm like, no, that's what Bertoia wanted, right? He wanted people to like actually like live in the space with these pieces. And so this was definitely something that had another purpose to it. This was made for the Zenith showroom in Chicago on Michigan Avenue. It is no longer extant. It closed in the 70s. And this was designed by an architecture firm, a local architecture firm in Chicago, Shaw, Metz, and Dolio. He worked very closely with the architect Alfred Shaw on this project. And you can kind of see there's all glass, you know, glass curtain walls right on the busiest thoroughfare in downtown Chicago. This is just south of the river. And this is what it looked like inside. So if you were kind of wondering like, oh, that was a real curatorial choice with that red wall, guys, that was not necessarily our choice. That was absolutely integral to the original commission. So the entirety of the space actually really didn't have a lot of decoration to it at all. And when Shaw wrote Bertoia in January of 1959 about the commission, he said, the room is going to be very unadorned, very simple, but we do hope to have an eye catcher. And the eye catcher that they came up with is the Bertoia wall. And Shaw was very specific, working with the client, that they picked bittersweet, a bittersweet colored wall, which is this kind of orangey reddish color. So this was always part of the, you know, ours is new, but it was always part of the commission. And as you can see, there were Zenith televisions and radios in the showroom. None of these were for sale, an interesting kind of retail model in the 50s. It was just where people could come in and see the newest technology offered by Zenith. And so we have all these different televisions, a really great ashtray stand over in that right-hand corner, a different moment. And it became a kind of, it was very interesting because the clients, when Shaw brings to Zenith this idea of having Bertoia do a commission, they were like, I don't know, this really doesn't have anything to do with what we do. Originally it was meant to just have the central left-hand orb. That was where the commission had kind of started from. And I'm gonna go just up, yeah. So the central orb actually relates to a number of commissions that he did roughly around the same time period for corporate clients. So the Geigy Pharmaceutical Company, for example, this was included in the Whitney's exhibition Business Buys American Art. You can kind of see that sunburst, that primary sunburst orb shape, very much related to the Zenith composition as well, or thinking about the commissions that he does for the Kodak Corporation. It's kind of blending in on that brick wall in the upper photograph, but he did another kind of rectangular sunburst form, and then the incredible dandelions that he does for Kodak's pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair. So this was a kind of form and corporate client patronage that Bertoia was thinking about, and you can see kind of in his correspondence with the architect how he's, I love this like little sketch at the bottom when they're essentially telling him like, we need to have like more going on. It can't be the kind of central form. We need to have something that like speaks to to communication, right? This is what Zenith does. How do we make this a little bit more, you can imagine like the corporate client being like, we need it a little less subtle. So he's kind of doing these sketches for them. And again, this back and forth where you have the artist working with the client to really get them what they want. Again, not something that we think about with the modern artist. So you can see that these are very complicated kind of engineering questions as well. Bertoia is very involved with the install and will go to these sites to do install. And with the Zenith Commission, this was something that was lit and had what he described as a syncopated rhythm to it. So when Zenith kind of came back, they're like, we need to have a group that conveys what they called the abstract concept of electronics communication. So how do you do that in sculpture, right? And so the kind of bronze form, the really dark kind of amoeba-like form, always stays lit. And then the other sculptures talk with one another in this kind of rhythm. And you can think about like 1959, what's going on like in jazz, for example, right? There's a kind of resonance with that rhythm to it. And by the end, as I mentioned, Zenith is like, oh, all their press release is going out around the time of the install, which Bertoia goes to Chicago to do. You see him working on it in his studio in Pennsylvania, and then on site during the opening. And in the papers and all the press releases, Zenith is like, we're the first one in Chicago to have a Bertoia. This is amazing. This speaks to the modern mindset, and this parallels. Like they actually put out a press release that says like, this is exactly what we're doing in our electronic laboratories, right? Zenith and Bertoia were pioneers, were progressive. And I think that's also another really, we titled the show with Mid-Century Modern Life in it, because I think what Bertoia is exploring and doing is what we see going on in industry, in technology, in science. There's a lot of resonance between there's a direct evocation going on there, even if Bertoia is trying to remain a little bit more subtle in his artistic reference of it. And the piece that we now see today, this is from their official photograph of the work. Zenith will dedicate the piece when the showroom closes in Chicago. They had two showrooms, one in New York, one in Chicago. They both closed in the 1970s, and Zenith, to great fanfare, donates it to the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where it has remained in their collection ever since. And we were super thrilled that they were willing to lend it to us, because it's really nice to have a proper large-scale commission in its entirety included in the exhibition. Now, you might remember, you might have wondered about my titling. This quote that it is from a Bertoia quote, which is my favorite, and I wanted to leave you with it today. So he says this in 1972. "It is my meaning that art should belong to everyday life. It should be incorporated in the society where it can be seen by everyone, where it can encourage a more open attitude towards art. By this, one could reduce the distance between today's art and the public. I am interested in my fellow beings, in what they say about me, and what I can tell them. The moment of sharing is equal to the moment of creation." And I think for me that has always remained a kind of touchstone in terms of why I respond so positively to Bertoia's work, but also something that to me feels really like something we need to keep a grasp on today. And I'm showing you, including with that quote, a clip from the Dallas Morning News around the time of the controversy. We see actually Bertoia talking with city officials in this photograph. But the quote that he said, and it's really funny actually looking back at the quotes around the Library Commission and how Bertoia himself is talking about the piece. But he said, and this was something I don't think really helped his case amongst Dallasites at the time, but he was like, it's a mirror to yourself. And I always wonder about knowing what was going on, exactly how cheeky that was. But I do think together you do get a sense that for Bertoia it really was about having art that did have function, and that was an asset, not something that should be derided when we think about art. And the large-scale commissions may be something we walk by and maybe people don't see, but they make the world a beautiful, more interesting place. And I think really were fundamental to the reshaping, particularly of urban environments in post-war America. And I think today still seem to me to provide a model for how to maybe better integrate art into everyday life. So thank you so much. And reach out if you have Bertoias.